Assalamu alaikum. Brother and sister, welcome back to Islamic Notes channel. Peter Sanders, convert to Islam who became a world-famous photographer. His professional career in photography began in the mid-60s. At that time, he became a photographer of famous artists in the music business, including Bob Dylan, Jimi Hendrix, The Doors, The Who, The Rolling Stones, and others. Until at one point he felt a gripping spiritual dryness. He decided to stop and began his spiritual journey. It is not easy for anyone to change their beliefs, especially when it concerns a fundamental issue of life, namely religion. When someone decides to change religion, their entire worldview changes completely. This change will have an impact on all dimensions of their life. It is no exaggeration to say that people who dare to decide to change religion are like humans who are reborn. Maybe this is why the stories of converts are always interesting to listen to and become a subject of reflection. One of the most interesting stories of converts to Islam is the life journey of Peter Sanders, a British photographer who decided to embrace Islam in the early 70s. Who would have thought that his decision would lead him to become one of the most prominent photographers in the world today? Early professional career. Peter Sanders was born in London in 1946. Not much is known about his childhood. His professional career in photography began in the mid-60s, where he was tasked with photographing most of the major stars in the music business, including Bob Dylan, Jimi Hendrix, The Doors, The Who, The Rolling Stones, and others. Interestingly, Sanders apparently only learned photography autodidactically. He never received a photography education, as most professional photographers do. Sanders' first photography course was actually taken in the late 1990s in Switzerland, or 3 decades after he had been in the photography world. That was because I got a project in Saudi Arabia that required the use of a large format camera, he said. However, his love for photography has been there since an early age. When he entered his teens, Sanders often had financial difficulties. In such conditions, he decided to pursue his hobby. As he admitted, his decision to enter the world of photography was only following his heart's calling, because he did not have the ability and expertise that could be relied on. Because of his hobby, he felt optimistic that he could survive in the world of photography, even though he did not have a flashy title as a photographer. Next, he began to dare to speculate by peddling his works to publishers, newspapers, magazines, or music album covers. Slowly, his works began to be accepted by the public. From there, he began his professional career, spiritual aridity, as Peter Sanders himself expressed in his interview with HTTP://muslimheritage.com, that in the 60s he had begun to feel spiritual restlessness. At that time, it was a period where people, Europe, began to reject the values of materialism that had existed since the Victorian era and wanted to find something that could fill their spiritual emptiness. In that era of mass restlessness, Peter Sanders chose to start his search from India. The reason was because he saw India as a place that was quite striking in its spiritual nuances. Peter Sanders' spiritual restlessness continued to the point where he began to ask substantial questions about life. What am I doing? And where am I going? It was at that time that he decided to leave the world of photography that had made his name and went to India. His main goal was to find a teacher who could answer all the questions that were hanging in his mind. Upon arriving in India, he began to explore one by one the religious identities that existed there, starting from Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, and also reading a little about Islam. While in India, Peter Sanders lived in a remote village. He rented a simple house, which coincidentally was close to a mosque. It was there that he claimed to have first become acquainted with Islam. While in India, Sanders performed a meditation ritual every morning. Sometimes at the same time, he often heard the call to dawn prayer from the speakers of the mosque near his settlement. This phenomenon of the call to prayer was actually something new for Sanders. But over time, the impression began to disappear, and it had become routine for him. There was no desire to further explore Islam. His strong desire to deepen his understanding of Islam only emerged one morning at a train station. As usual, train stations in India were filled with passengers with all their belongings in various forms. Suddenly, in the midst of the hustle and bustle of people at the station, he saw an old woman spreading out her mat, then performing a prayer ritual there. Seeing this phenomenon, his heart was amazed. In his mind, he asked, how is it possible, in the midst of this hustle and bustle, that this woman can enter a silence of her own? He started to get curious. Then he tried to find out about the phenomenon. Peter Sanders asked the person nearby. The person simply replied, "This is my grandmother. She is a Muslim and she is praying." In his interview, Peter Sanders said, "So God showed me in a kind of snapshot what the essence of prayer is, and the great silence amidst the hustle and bustle of the world." Later, after embracing Islam, this angle became the distinctive color of Peter Sanders' photographic works. After decades, Sanders revealed why he ultimately decided to choose Islam. According to him, it was not he who chose Islam, but God chose Islam for me. Peter Sanders spent several months in India. According to his confession in one of the media interviews when he went to India and explored several religions and beliefs there, he actually already had a dream about the direction of spirituality that he hoped for. That is why he not only explored the texts, but also dived and observed more deeply the color of culture and the way of life of the people in India. And his experience at dawn at one of the train stations was one of the most amazing for him. After his spiritual journey in India, Peter Sanders decided to return to England. Unexpectedly, he found that many of his friends in England had converted to Islam. For him, this was an interesting thing, because while in India, he studied Hindu and Buddhist religious texts, but not Islam. As he admits, "I traveled a lot in the first months when I was in India, and I went to Amritsar in the state of Bihar, and I also went to Allahabad at the time of the Kumbh Mela, which was attended by about 10 million people. After that, I went to Hyderabad and then ended up in the south, where I stayed for 6 months. So I didn't encounter that side of Islam at all at that time." Upon returning to England, he had not yet decided which religion he would choose. Therefore, when he discovered that many of his friends were Muslims, he saw an opportunity to learn more about the religion. In one of his interviews with www.islamreligion.com, Peter Sanders said that when he was in India for months, he actually found one teacher who was Hindu, but generally had morals that he called Muslim quality. It was from this person that Peter Sanders studied spirituality for 6 months. At that time, he was still 24 years old. In England, Peter Sanders did not delve too deeply into Islam, but he saw that this religion had everything he had hoped for. Finally, in 1970, Peter Sanders declared himself a Muslim. According to him, the decision was a big leap in his life. In another interview several years ago, Sanders revealed the secret of why he finally decided to choose Islam. According to him, it was not he who chose Islam, but God chose Islam for me, he said. After embracing Islam, Peter Sanders changed his name to Abd al-Adhim, and only 3 months after that, he decided to perform the Hajj pilgrimage. According to him, this intention first arose because he was driven by the desire to accompany his old teacher. At that time, he did not have the money to go with him, but unexpectedly, someone gave him a ticket so he could go. However, his teacher breathed his last on the way. Sanders heard the news when he was right in front of the Kaaba. Furthermore, Sanders' first Hajj experience inspired him to photograph the rare colossal moment. So in 1971, Sanders decided to ask for special permission from the Saudi Arabian government to photograph the Kaaba during the Hajj season. Initially, the permit was difficult to obtain because the local government considered the world of photography cynical, especially since he was a convert. But then Sanders met the right official so that the permit could be issued. In addition to the difficulty of obtaining permission from the local government, it was not easy to find a suitable angle to photograph the Grand Mosque and the Kaaba during the peak of the Hajj season. As Sanders admitted, to get a high-quality image of the Kaaba's Kiswa, he was only allowed to put up lights in front of the Kaaba's door for 1 hour. That was in the early hours of the morning. But how surprised Sanders was, it turned out that the resulting image was more than expected. The image was sharp and clear, so that it could display in detail the gold thread that decorated the Kiswa. It could even capture a large moth that was perched on the Kiswa. Interestingly, when Sanders took this photo, He had never even taken a photography course. In fact, to achieve the work he produced at that time, professional skills were needed that were usually possessed by world architectural photographers. For Sander personally, the photos of his work in Mecca were an unexpected result, and only by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is why he printed and hung the results of his work in the prayer room of his house. But for the Western world at that time, the photos taken by Peter Sanders in the Holy Land turned out to be one of the rare objects of photography. For the first time, the Western world witnessed the center of Muslim worship activities in classy photographic works. These photos then appeared in the Sunday Times magazine, The Observer, and in a number of other major journals as a recognition of their rarity. And from that moment on, Peter Sander, alias Abdul-Adhim, became increasingly famous. The Hajj photography project became a turning point in Peter Sanders' professional life. In addition to giving new life to Sanders' soul, Islam apparently gave spirit to his work. Islam also inspired him on a new path to further pursue the world of photography, but with different objects. Next, Sanders was determined to capture the spirit of Islam and present it in his photographic works. He saw Islamic civilization as a compact building structure, and the core or center of the building structure is Sufism. This is the target of his shooting. Since his success in taking the best pictures in the city of Mecca, Peter Sanders found his path in life. He remains committed to the world of photography that he has loved since childhood. But this time he has a far and unlimited vision. He wants to capture the spirit, civilization of Islam and present it in photographic works. In one of his interviews, Sanders once revealed the background of the birth of the vision. He remembered one of the Urdu poems that reads, "To see the reality of Medina, you need more than sight, you need vision." He likewise with Islam. To understand this religion, you cannot just see what is visible on the surface, but there is a spirit or spirit behind it that must be found and captured. This is where the vision is needed. From this basic thought, Sanders decided to travel around the Islamic world to hunt for the spirit of Islamic civilization. Before traveling around the world, Peter Sanders had a discussion with a Muslim friend. His friend said that Islamic civilization is like a compact house structure, and the core or center of the structure is Sufism. If the core is removed from the structure of Islamic civilization, then the core will lose its protection. But if only the outside is taken without capturing the core inside, you will lose the real spirit. The results of the conversation between Sanders and his friend were quite impressive for Sanders. From here, he found a vision and orientation in building his work. He saw that to find something special in Islamic civilization, he had to comb through the traditional Islamic community. Gradually, he discovered a worrying process of decadence in the condition of the society. He saw the traditions of traditional Islamic society rapidly diminishing and disappearing from the earth. Likewise with the scholars and pious people who live in our time. Without realizing it, they died one by one without having time to be immortalized in a moment. Sanders also hunted against time to capture the dying tradition. For decades, Sanders traveled around the Islamic world, from England to Indonesia, from China to Africa. In the process, his photography skills improved tremendously. Some observers even say that he is the best photographer in the Islamic world today. During his more than 40 years of hunting, Sanders has captured hundreds of thousands of internationally recognized objects. Through his works, he has succeeded in bridging the relationship between Islam and the West. Sanders acts as a spokesperson for Islam to the Western world. Through his quality works, the Western world can get to know the Islamic world more deeply, clearly, and meaningfully. Currently, Sanders owns the Peter Sanders Photography Library. It is a kind of library that documents Sanders' work throughout his 40-year career in the Muslim world. There are more than 250,000 photos in digital form there. He sells them for magazines or books about Islam. Here is a glimpse of Peter Sanders' hunt after more than 40 years of hunting in the Muslim world. When asked about the thing that inspired him the most during his career, Sanders replied that it was the Quran. In the Quran, it is said that we can see signs of Allah's power around us and also within ourselves. According to Sanders, these two dimensions are present all the time. There is the outside world that we experience, and there is what happens to us inside. The two things must interact with each other. But he says that these days many Muslims have become very literal in their approach to Islam, and they have forgotten the inner dimension. But that inner dimension has been my focus from the beginning. I have spent my life looking at creation, contemplating it, and trying to understand it. So that is what I try to teach in my photography workshops. We, that is myself and all who support me in this endeavor, call our workshops the art of seeing. It is so called because the workshops are not so much about the technical side of photography, but about relearning how to see what surrounds us. People are often so busy with their lives that they forget to stop and look. He further said, photography is about setting the moment. You have to calm yourself so that you can be in a state to really see something. Otherwise, your mind is always chattering. It blocks your vision. You have to learn to calm yourself. Sanders' decades of traveling around the Islamic world have led him to understand that morality is the essence of Islamic life. According to him, the challenge facing Islam is that we must become Islam. That is also the way to spread Islam correctly. Now it is 2019. That means Peter Sanders' hunt has been going on for 50 years since he decided to dedicate his life to photographing the spirit of Islam in 1971. During those 5 decades, he has gone through many obstacles and challenges. One of the sharpest criticisms he received was the religious rule on whether or not to take pictures, photograph of living creatures. But Sanders managed to get through these things with ease. Honestly, it was just what I did, so I didn't see much of a problem. After a while, of course, I realized that some people thought it was wrong. I tried to understand their point of view, but in the end I came to the understanding that what is really forbidden is making a 3-dimensional image of a person, creature, and idolizing it. But I always felt that a photograph is like looking at your face in a mirror or looking at a reflection in a pond. I'm not creating something that isn't there, nor am I using images to worship. Another thing is that I often photograph people who are very spiritually and scholastically evolved. They never refuse to let me photograph them. So if it's wrong, why do these people let me do it? And on the other hand, the people who come to you and say that photography is haram, well, when you talk to them about it, you can sense that their whole nature is very narrow, often very judgmental, and usually not very scientific. So until someone can come up with evidence that I can accept, I'm not going to bother. When asked about his views on Islamophobia, Sanders replied, "These are all complex issues, of course. We cannot say, for example, that the minority, Muslims, who are fueling this radical and deviant view of Islam do not exist. And the problem with that kind of minority is that they always shout so loudly that everyone becomes aware of them. Whereas what I call the silent majority tends to go unnoticed. In fact, I think the silent majority, including me, have to find out what Islam really is. And above all, we have to be Islam. We can't say Islam is peace, and then as soon as something goes wrong in our lives, we start screaming and shouting. No one would believe that Islam is peaceful if we weren't peaceful beings. I often wonder what would happen if 10,000 Muslims went out to protest, sat down, were quiet, behaved, and maybe said a prayer. A bit like Buddhists, they are often better examples of that peace than we are. So I really don't understand why Muslims are so quick to feel that they have to shout and scream. It doesn't change anything, it doesn't help the situation. But how do you influence all that? I don't really know. As I said, the challenge that Islam faces is that we have to be Islam. That's also how Islam is spread, by the example of a few very spiritually evolved people who are kind and compassionate. They have all the wonderful qualities that you can find in any great person of any religion. In other words, Sanders wants to say that every person is an image, objectification of their own spirituality. His decades of experience have led him to understand that morality is the essence of Islamic life. That is why he created a unique photography project entitled Meetings with Mountains. The content is about important figures who are known to have high and noble morals. Sanders likens these people to mountains among humans. As Sanders said in his interview, one of the reasons I really wanted to bring all these great people together is because it's a spiritual side of Islam that is almost never presented. In every religion, there are holy men, but somehow a lot of people don't think you can find them in Islam. And a lot of Muslims don't even know about them because they don't seek fame, and so they often stay hidden. Sanders' work, Meeting with Mountains, was launched on July 10, 2019 in London. The book consists of 380 pages and contains 250 photographs of men and women from all over the Islamic world that Sanders has met since 1971. Some of them are still alive, but most of them have died. Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, in the foreword to this book, said, "They, those featured in this book, stand above the average human achievement, not by their worldly success, but by their inner achievement to overcome the ego and understand the true purpose of humanity, namely to know, love, and serve the divine." Convert story. Peter Sanders, From Bob Dylan to the Door of the Kaaba. Peter Sanders was born in London in 1946. His professional career in photography began in the mid-1960s, where he photographed most of the stars in the music industry, such as Bob Dylan, Jimi Hendrix, The Doors, The Who, The Rolling Stones, etc. Towards the end of the 1970s, Sanders turned to a spiritual quest that took him to India and eventually to the Muslim world, where the spiritual beauty of Islam left an indelible impression on him. After returning to England, he converted to Islam and changed his name to Abd al-Adhim. In 1971, he had the opportunity to photograph the Hajj pilgrimage. His images appeared in the Sunday Times Magazine, The Observer, and in a number of other major media outlets in recognition of their rarity. For Peter Sanders, faith and photography have been part of his spiritual development. It was his quest to capture the essence of reality that led him to Islam and, camera in hand, to the door of the Kaaba. From photographing the music industry's most famous idols to the holiest site in the Islamic world, Peter Sanders' journey involves more than just a change in the focus of his camera lens. After photographing almost every famous person in the music industry, I got bored and spiritually restless. I finally decided to go to India. I packed up and went looking for a guru. I finally found one, a Hindu. I studied with him for 6 months. In India, Sanders lived in a house next to a mosque. When he woke up to meditate in the morning, he would hear the call to prayer every day, over and over again. One thing that then had an impact on him. One time at dawn, he was at a train station, surrounded by Indians waiting with all their belongings. Suddenly in the crowd, he saw a woman spreading out a prayer mat and praying. How could there be a calmness that was undisturbed by the circumstances around her in the midst of all this hustle and bustle? Sanders thought. Sanders was curious and asked what was going on. A young man said, "This is my grandmother. She is a Muslim and she is praying." He felt as if God was showing him, in a kind of snapshot, what prayer is and how the silence is created amidst the activity. When I came back to London, I found that some of my friends, some musicians and others, had become Muslims, which was quite interesting for me because I had studied Hindu traditions in India and I didn't know much about Islam. I was 24 years old at the time, and within 3 months of becoming a Muslim, I decided to go for Hajj. I had no money, I only had the intention. My old Muslim teacher at the time also had the intention to perform Hajj, and I also wanted to go. Someone gave me a ticket and I went. It was at the Kaaba that I learned that my teacher had died on the way. At the time in 1971, photographs of the Hajj were rare. Peter Sanders was given special permission to photograph the holy sites, a decision that still amazes him. It was very unusual for a Westerner to photograph the Hajj. I had to go from office to office in Jeddah and Mecca, and finally I found a man who had the authority to give me permission. Most people were not willing to take responsibility at that time, and they were generally not very interested in photography, let alone a convert. But this man had the authority to give me permission, and he did it purely out of trust. For Peter Sanders, photography is essentially a means of capturing the spirit of Islam. As he describes his attempts to do this, the words of an Urdu poet come to mind. To see the reality of Medina, you need more than sight, you need vision. As if trying to have this vision, Peter Sanders then tries to convey it to others. He has spent the last 30 years documenting the dying remnants of traditional Islamic society. One of his projects is to immortalize Islamic tradition in the form of a compilation of photographic albums of contemporary scholars and clerics. He photographs scholars who have never been photographed before in the cities and countries he visits, saying that these simple people represent the true face of Islam. Peter Sanders, internationally recognized as one of the world's leading Islamic photographers. Photography has always been an extension of my life, he says. Photography is an amazing process, a gift from God that allows me to learn so much about myself and the world around me. It's like chasing moments, like trying to capture a beautiful bird in flight. The photographs are very, very beautiful, said Japanese art critic Tsuyoshi Kawasoe. One should not underestimate the importance of Peter Sanders' work, says American author Michael Sugich. He is the only photographer working today who systematically and with great devotion to his task has covered a vast area of the Isla world. Because of his deep understanding of the culture and his refined spiritual concepts, he was able to photograph places and peoples that were almost inaccessible to Western photographers. He has left an unforgettable, poetic, and moving record of an extraordinary moment in a richly enchanting culture. Sanders' photographs have appeared in many international publications, including Time Magazine, Paris Match, The Observer, the Sunday Times Magazine, Aramco World, and the London-based pan-Arab news magazine Al Majalla, which published his work as a cover story. His exclusive photographs of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina are in great demand. Peter Sanders Photography Limited encompasses travel, location, and studio photography, a photography library of over 120,000 slides, and the production of fine art prints.